I wanted to talk about a book called The Namesake. This book talks about identity and culture in a very interesting way. The main character, Nikhil, was born in America to two parents who had recently moved to the US from Kolkata, India. Throughout the book, he struggles with his identity of being an American Deshi, as well as with his birth name and its meaning. Nikhil was born with the name Gogol, because his dad feels as though his life was saved from a train incident because he was reading a book from his favorite author, Nikolai Gogol. However, Nikhil despises the name for the most of the book, only starting to truly come to terms with it at the very end. It is also for this reason that I will refer to him as Nikhil, which is what he legally changes his name to. As a side note, I think that there are two most probable reasons for why the author chose to continue calling him Gogol throughout the duration of the book. The first is that she wanted to make it easier for the reader, so that they did not have to keep up with the name changing. The second is that she still feels he is Gogol the entire time, which could either reflect what Gogol is thinking, or be more symbolic of the fact that he is still the same person with the same family the whole time. In the book, his name is also representative of his cultural identity and is symbolic of his heritage. So the fact that he is able to so easily change his name brings up another question. Is it possible to change your identity? Hold up. Why does this necessarily mean he changed his identity? Yeah, that's a good question. Without further information, it would be difficult to say. However, in the beginning of the book, Nikhil actually loves the name Gogol, and only grows to despise it over time. When his parents originally told him that he was going to get a good name, he says he doesn't want a new name. He can't understand why he would answer to anything other than Gogol. This is on page 57. This, compounded with the repeated use of names being symbolic of identity, shows that he has at least changed his stance on his identity. It could still be possible for him to always have had the identity that is associated with the name Nikhil, but we get further evidence that this is not the case because around the time of him changing his name, he feels as though he is two people, one Nikhil and one Gogol. This can be seen when he goes to a party at a nearby college. There, he kisses a girl who he introduces himself to as Nikhil. When he gets back to his friends, Lahiri tells us that he thinks that it wasn't him who kissed the girl, that Gogol had nothing to do with it, on page 96. So I guess it is possible to change identity. Well, not quite. This shows that Nikhil feels as though he has a split identity, not even necessarily that it completely changed. You see, from the very beginning, he did not fully identify as being Indian, often trying to break away from his parents even when he was very young. One example of this is when, on his first day at school, Nikhil insists that the school continue calling him Gogol, despite his parents' desires for the school to call him Nikhil, on page 59. So really, what you're saying is that this is more of a representation of his fractured identity and his shift on perspective of his identity than an actual change in the identity itself. Moreover, in many ways, he eventually ends in a state where he feels at ease with being Indian, learning how to accept his heritage. This can be seen when, at the very end of the book, Nikhil begins reading the overcoat. The overcoat is symbolic of the name Gogol, not only because the author's last name was Gogol, but also because this is the exact book that his father attributed to saving his life, and thus becoming the namesake. The fact that this book is a representation of the name Gogol, and that Gogol is used as a metaphor for his heritage, means finding the book is symbolic of reclaiming his heritage. Okay, but how do we know that Nikhil feels this way too? Well, when he finds the book, Nikhil expresses that, until moments ago, the book was destined to disappear from his life entirely, but he had salvaged it by chance on pages 290 to 291, which shows that he also believes that he was able to come to terms with his identity in the end. I would argue that this is a change. One could make the claim that his true identity is that of his heritage. But I think that throughout the book, Lahiri makes it clear that, at least for much of the time, he does not identify in that way. Additionally, even if you could say that this is, in fact, where he started, I would say that he changed in the middle. That is a good point. But then, wouldn't this be evidence that you always end up where you started? Well, not really. As we said earlier, it isn't even so cut and dry that he even started as identifying with being Indian. It also cannot necessarily be used as a sweeping claim. There are other characters who changed throughout the book. But wouldn't it also be fair to say that these things were just changes of how one views their identity, not the identity itself? I mean, it's not like Nikhil starts out as being Indian American, changes to not being Indian, and then re-becomes Indian throughout the course of the novel. That's correct. But a change in personal identity does not necessarily mean that those things change about you. If someone really loves sports, but only later on in life identifies as being an athlete, that would both be an example of someone changing their identity and not having it coincide with a concrete change in who they are/what they do. Okay, but couldn't you say that they were an athlete all along, but just didn't feel like an athlete until later in life? You could, but wouldn't it still be a change in identity? I mean, that depends on what you consider identity. Also, what about someone who never liked sports until later on in life, and when they start liking them, they identify as an athlete? Didn't they change their identity? Fair point. But that's not what happened in this novel. That is indeed a good case where identity can change, but that is not what happens in the book. So even though one can change their identity, does the book make that claim? Also, maybe the book is talking about interpersonal identity instead of intrapersonal identity. That is identities which society places on you instead of the identities you choose for yourself. Note that my use of the word choose does not actually mean that you have a choice in the matter of what your identity is, just that it comes from within you instead of from someone else outside. It could be talking about interpersonal identity, but in that case, it is almost definitionally something which you don't have the power to change. Not necessarily. Going back to your analogy of the athlete, in the first example, someone who always liked sports would have the interpersonal identity as an athlete, as many people would consider them an athlete even if the person themselves didn't. Exactly. But in the second example, where the person didn't even like sports to begin with, they would clearly have changed their identity even as an outside person would see them. Didn't you just show that you can change your interpersonal identity? Well, in a way, yes. But I was more showing that this is not a definitional reason why you can't change it. In the context of the book, it is really talking about things you can't change, i.e. your race. So you mean intrinsic interpersonal identity? Correct. Then I would still say that definitionally you can't. I'm not saying that this is exactly what Nikhil does, but what if someone decided that instead of actually changing their race, they were going to convince other people that they were of a different race, or trying to use genetics to prove that they were not the race that people normally think of? This is why I say it is not definitional. Although I do still believe that it can't be changed, it's just a case for why it's not definitional. In that case, I think it can be changed. What people call different races can change over time. Irish and Italian, for example, used to not even be considered white. That is definitely something to think about. It becomes more of a discussion of social constructs if you think about it that way. I would also argue that the book supports the idea that you can change what other people think of you. Nikhil is able to get other people to think of and refer to him as Nikhil. Yeah, but I think that the people who knew him before he changed his name still think of him with his old name, such as his parents, who continue to call him Gogol when there isn't anyone else around. Yes, but the same cannot be said for Moshumi. She actually does think of Nikhil as just that, Nikhil. Fair point. But couldn't one say that he was Nikhil all along? In some way he is. But that is not the way other people see him. This puts you in a double bind. If you make the claim about interpersonal identity, it must be changeable, as we just described. And if you're talking about intrapersonal identity, then it must also be changeable, as described earlier. I guess you're right, but I still feel like it shouldn't be a direct answer. Well, it doesn't have to be. As we already saw, this question is incredibly complex, and much of it comes down to how you describe identity. When talking about interpersonal identity, it also has a great deal to do with social constructs, and in these ways, it is certainly more complex than a simple yes or no. Well, that's it.